Let's talk about Python classes. So in this beginner tutorial, I'm going to walk you through some examples, really showcasing you step by step how you can get started using classes within Python to work towards what's so-called object-oriented programming. We are going to cover the very basics, starting with the structure of a class. So how do you type it out? Then we talk about the different elements that are within a class that you need to understand. So these are things like the constructor, the attributes, and the methods. So by the end of this tutorial, you will understand all of those concepts. I'm also going to share all of the code and this GitHub repository with you for reference, because I know in the beginning that wrapping your head around this can be pretty confusing. Well, it's pretty straightforward. I know that when I was learning this, I constantly had to refer back to examples. And that's why I want to provide this for you. So you not only can go through this right now, but you can also save and store this as a reference for later projects. And then finally, once we get some clarity on the basic use cases of working with classes, I'm also going to show you an example of how I would actually use this in an actual project in my work as an AI engineer. So I'm going to provide you with an example that you can just copy paste and run. So everything really starts to click, because sometimes what can really be a problem with beginner tutorials is that you understand the elements at the very basic individual level, but then don't see the whole picture of how everything would come together in the bigger picture, in the total project. So that's really my goal here with this tutorial. So let's dive in. In order to follow along, you only need a Python installation, and I will be walking you through this within VS Code. And I'm going to be using the interactive terminal. So I'm going to start that up here. And if you want to learn more about how I do this, then check out a video in the description here called My Development Workflow, where I show you how to do this. But first, let's talk about why you want to use classes, why you want to understand them. And in short, it's basically to create more reusable and modular code. So in the beginning, when you're a beginner developer, probably what you do is how you write code is you create one Python file and you start at the top and you just continue on creating some variables here, some lists there, etc. You go on and on. Maybe you're already using functions, but in the end, it's just like one big file where there's maybe a lot of overlap and redundancy. And then if you later come back and look into that, it might be confusing, like what was this variable and how does this work? And it can get messy real quickly. And this is, of course, completely fine in the beginning. That's how I learned to program as well. But once you get a little bit better and a little bit more comfortable, what you ideally would like to do is try to work in a more structured way. And classes can really help with that. So really at the core, classes allow you to define blueprints for creating objects. And we'll get into that, what that means, but basically means we can create a little box, let's call it, where you can store data into that box, but you can also store behavior within that box in the form of functions. So we don't necessarily change the output of our code, but rather we refactor it for usability and readability. So now let's look at the structure of a class. And when it comes to the structure, there are some elements that we first just have to understand from a syntax perspective. So this is just the way how Python works. And then we can get more into how to actually use this. So here's an example of the various elements that make up a class. So to create a class in Python, you start with simply typing out class, lowercase, followed by a space, and then we type out the class name. Now it's important to note that the Python language in general only uses lowercase letters. But when it comes to classes, we use camel case. So we start with a capital letter, here the C, and then if it's two words, the second name also starts with a capital letter. Now, this is not something that you necessarily have to do, or if you don't do it, it doesn't work, but this is just standard Python notation. So it's good to adhere to that and work on those best practices. Now, I know that when you're new to classes, this all seems very abstract, and I'm going to use a very simple example to help you think through all of this, but naturally along the way, there are going to be some elements where you might feel like, okay, I follow this, I understand how to do this, but why am I doing this? And what is the purpose of this? And bear with me, once we get through all the building blocks and then actually bring everything together, that is where most of the things will most likely start to click for you. So we are going to use a simple example of a class about pets. So this class will capture some information. So for example, a pet can have a name, a pet can have a species, so it's a cat or a dog, for example. And then we're also going to introduce a function in there to do something with that information. So now let's actually come over to the code editor and start building out our pet class. So if we look at the structure, we start by typing out class, then we type pet with a capital P, and that is the first part. And then we get into the second and probably the most confusing part in the beginning. This is really that abstract thing where you have to see it a couple of times in order to make it click. But that is this init method over here. And it's a function, although it's a special function. It is called the constructor. So special method that is called when an instance of the class is created. So remember, we create these classes to later reuse them within our code and do something with it. So first we define the class, that is what you see over here. And then later when we want to do something with it, we create an instance. That's what it's called. And upon creating an instance, this is the function that is called automatically, just by using or creating this class. So in it, I always remember it from initialization. So upon creating the instance, this will run, and there's a special notation to this. So it must follow the 2 underscores in it and then also 2 underscores. And then we get into the part where it's similar to how a regular function works, where we can have parameters and do things with that. But there's one difference in there, and that is also this notion of self. And this is also something that is completely unique to working with classes compared to functions. And this again relates back to creating those instances where every time we create a new instance, this self parameter refers to that particular instance. And now, like I've said, this is probably very abstract right now. So let's actually see what that could look like in the pet class to get a little bit more clear on this. So we continue and we define the init. Now, then we continue using the notation of a standard function, but we put in the self. And then we think about what kind of elements do we want to capture within this class. And now I already mentioned that a pet, for example, can have a name and a pet can also have a species. So let's follow the standard notation of a function following by a colon, and then we actually get into the function. So let's now have a look about what we can do over here. And we could do basically anything that you can do within a regular function as well, but mostly what you will see in classes is that we set attributes. And with attributes, we take the parameters that, for example, the user has provided to us, and we really set it to the self element so that it now becomes part of the class. So what that then could look like in our pet example is we could say self.name equals the name that the user has provided. And similarly, we can do self.species and we can set that equal to the species that the user has provided. So this now means that when we have this class, in order to create it, it needs a name and a species as input, and upon creating an instance, it will run this function and set the name and the species accordingly. So let's now actually see what that looks like. So if I store this in memory, I can now create an instance. So this is the part I was talking about. We have first defined the class, and now we're going to use it to create an instance. So let's say we want to create an instance for a dog. So we'll say dog equals, and then we call our class. And as input parameters, we're going to have to provide a name. And let's call the dog Buddy. And species, we're going to set that equal to dog. So now we can run this. And now we can have a look at this instance that we have just created. So if I look at the instance of the pet class dog and just print it, for example, over here, I can just see there's not much here. This basically means that it's an object within memory, but we don't see anything that's going on over here. For example, we don't see Buddy, we don't see dog. So now what we can then do in order to actually use the data, to use the information of this class created, is we can call the attributes using a dot notation. So similarly to how we set the self.name equals to name, you should really view self, you should view that now as the dog variable that we have created over here. So if I now hit a dot and I, for example, take the name and I print that, you can see that we now get Buddy. And similarly, I can call dog.species and we get dog. So now if we come back to the example, we have covered the first basic structure of how to define a class, then how to put in the parameters, how to then set those parameters as attributes, how to create an instance of that class by calling the class and putting in the parameters, and then, since there are now attributes, how we can call them from the instance using the dot notation following the names of the attributes. So as you can see, there are a lot of terms and abstractions over here that we're using, but at the core, this is really what you can do with a class. And that's also why I said you probably have to get back to this, come back to this a couple of times, see a couple of different examples before this really clicks. But really, this is it at the core. And now to give you another example of creating another instance as well, we can, for example, compare dog and cat, where the cat is called Whiskers and it's a cat. And we now have the dog and we have the name and the species. But similarly, we can also do cat.name and we have Whiskers, and we can do cat.species. So it's the same class, different instances, and therefore different data. And now you can already probably start to imagine what we can do by defining a class one time, defining the structure, and then reusing it later throughout our code. Because if we wanted to do this without using a class, we would again have to define, okay, cat has a name, cat has a species, etc. And that would result in a lot of redundant code. And right now it's very simple. We want another instance. We now want a cat. Okay, let's call it. And we don't have to change this. All right, so far we've looked at creating a simple instance of the class using just some simple parameters and setting them as attributes. But classes can also contain functions. And when you use a function within a class, you call it a method. And a method is, again, not any different really from using a regular function, as we can capture all kinds of logic in it, we can return stuff. But the only difference again here is that we put the self parameter in here in order to make sure that the instance has access to its own information. So let's now look at an example where I've created a function called introduce, and I have extended the pet class with it. And it's a simple print statement, and it says, hello, my name is self.name and I am self.species. So this is a simple print statement to print out the information of the instance of the class. And here you can see why we have to use the self, because we use the self here to refer to its own attributes. Again, so referring to the dog, referring to the cat whenever we call this introduce function. So calling functions on a class instance is actually very similar to how you call the attributes. So we use the dot notation, but instead we now also have to use parentheses. So let me show you what that looks like if we store this into memory again. We create another instance. So we have the dog, and let's also do the cat. So that is now in memory again. Let me clear that up. And now we can do dog.introduce, and we run this line and we say, hello, my name is Buddy and I'm a dog. And for the cat, hello, my name is Whiskers and I'm a cat. So that is how you use the methods of a class, following the dot notation, using the parentheses. Now, the final thing that I want to show you here before I show the example of how I use this structure within my projects is how you can update attributes of an instance. So if we look at the dog right now, if you look at Buddy, Buddy is now saying that his name is Buddy and he's a dog. But we can also override those. And next to overwriting, we can also introduce completely new attributes, all using the same notation. So I can, for example, take the dog instance, which is Buddy right now, and I can override it and now call him Max. And if I now call the introduce, Max will now say, hello, my name is Max and I'm a dog. But we can just as well define a new attribute by calling dog.color. So that is not in the original structure of the class, but we can later add that. And when I now come in here and, for example, say dog.color, you can see that it works just the same way. All right, so that covers this beginner tutorial really on classes and how you can work with them. And now again, you probably have to few a couple of more examples, redo this exercise maybe a couple of times before it really clicks and you start to get the hang of it. But what I now really want to do is I want to show you how I use classes and how I structure them within the projects that I work on, because I knew that for myself in the beginning, this took me a very long time to figure out. I quite quickly understood how you could structure a class, how you could create a class. So like this, it's if you watch it, it's pretty easy to wrap your head around it. But then how you actually use this in a project to really write really cool code, actually, that took me a long time to figure out. So I'm going to show you this example with a data service that I have created. Now, if you're new to Python and you look at all of this code, you're like, what's going on over here? Don't worry about it. I'll make this available as an example. I just want to show you what's possible. So the way I like to structure my projects is where whenever I create a project, I have some code and then I create a separate folder called services. So this is a particular design pattern that I use. This is, again, not something that alters the functionality, but it's just a folder structure and a naming convention that I like to use. And then if I have some kind of like complex calculations or methods or connections to an API, I want to create separate services for that. And in this example, I have created a data service. And what this data service does is there is some simple data within this project repository. So it's very simple dummy data. It's a product, a quantity, and a price. And there's some dummy numbers in there. And what this data service does is it takes the data, it first processes it by adding some calculations. Then it creates a report, and then it also creates an image of that report. So it creates a plot. And it does all of that all from within the data service. So here you can see we have the same structure. So there's nothing new, it's just more of the same. Where we have the initialization, then we have various methods like load data, process data, export data, generate a report. We have some ways to create a chart, and we can set some styling. And then finally, we have a run function, which just kicks off the whole pipeline. And now the cool thing is, by doing this and importing that data service, so importing that class, so this is already a little bit more advanced. But what we can do by defining it in this file, the data service, and then importing it in the main file over here, we can create the instance within this file without having to look at all of the other code. And this is really where the reusability and modular code comes in, because now this data service I can not only use maybe in this file over here, but also maybe in another file within this project, but also maybe even in a completely different project. And what I want to show you right now, before I give a little bit of details on this, is if I come in here and I import this data service and I create the instance and I now run the data processing pipeline, what it will do behind the scenes, it will take this raw data, it will process it, create a processed CSV file over here. Sorry, first it will put it in the interim over here. So it will create calculations, put it in here. It will create a sales report, put it in this folder, and it will also create a figure, that figure that you're seeing over here, and store it in the figures folder. And this is now just 2 lines of code. So there are a lot of comments over here, but we do an import, and with 2 lines of code, I can do an entire data pipeline to create, let's say, a weekly report. So if you work in sales, for example, and you're an analyst, data analyst in sales, for example, you could create data services like this with various functions where, for example, every week or every month, someone puts a new Excel or a new CSV file somewhere on, I don't know, SharePoint or Google Drive or whatever. And you can create a service around that where if you structure it correctly once, then all you have to do every once per week, for example, once per month, you come in here and you just run this and that's it. And you have another report. So that's how I wanted to wrap up this video. I know if you look at this and you're new to using classes, you're probably new to Python. This is a lot, but just remember that it's not much more than what we did over here, but we just stacked more functionality within the same class. And I wanted to show you this because I always like to begin with the end in mind. So why should you learn this? Why do you want to learn this? And for me, it was not until I figured out that, okay, wait, this is actually pretty cool. I can create some really cool code with this come in here and now just hit one function and it will kick off the entire pipeline. It was not until then that I started to change my own way of working. So that's also, for example, when I really switched from mainly using Jupyter notebooks to only working in Python files, creating modular and reusable code, so that whenever the project that I work on, or for example, the clients that I work with, whenever I have to come back to a project, it's just very clear. Okay, we have a data service, what's in here? Okay, this is what it does. And then, okay, I can run it, etc. All right, and that's it for this video. Make sure to start this repository or clone it so you have it at hand. This repository is called AI Fundamentals. I plan to create a lot of more tutorials in here covering really the fundamentals of Python to create AI solutions. So you have this as a reference. You can look back to it. Now, if you find this video helpful, please leave a like and also consider subscribing. Like I've said, I create more videos on all things artificial intelligence and working with Python. So if that's something you're interested in, then definitely subscribe, and then I'll see you in the next one.